It's no secret that the U.S. is on a frighteningly apocalyptic financial trajectory. In today's video, I'll summarize how 2022 managed to compound all of our nation's fiscal woes with 7 terrifying charts. Hey folks, I'm David McKnight, best-selling author of The Power of Zero. Yes, the U.S. fiscal trajectory didn't do itself any favors in 2022. Here are 7 unnerving charts that tell the whole story. Chart number 1. Debt totaled $1.4 trillion in 2022. This was actually $339 billion higher than the $1 trillion deficit the Congressional Budget Office projected back in May, and well above levels we experienced pre-pandemic. However, it is well below the $2.8 trillion COVID-related deficit we experienced in 2021, which frankly isn't saying a whole lot. Chart number 2. Debt will rise significantly over the next decade. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimates under their baseline scenario that debt will reach 116% of GDP by 2032. They also produced 2 alternate scenarios that suggest that the debt outlook could be far worse than the baseline suggests. Under their intermediate alternate scenario, they project debt would reach 129% of GDP by 2032. And under their worst cost scenario, they estimate a debt to GDP ratio of 138% by 2032. According to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the intermediate alternate scenario assumes that lawmakers will extend the expiring individual tax cuts and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act beyond 2025, and that in light of recent national security and other needs, discretionary spending will grow somewhat faster than inflation and total about 0.5% of GDP higher than projected by the end of the decade. This scenario also includes more pessimistic economic assumptions with interest rates, inflation, and long-term economic growth halfway between the Fed's central and most pessimistic estimates. The result is $4.3 trillion of additional debt by 2032. The high-cost alternate scenario assumes that several other costly expiring provisions are extended, including various expiring business tax provisions, expanded Affordable Care Act subsidies, and expiring health extenders, and assumes discretionary spending growth with output so that it is about 1% of GDP higher than projected by 2032. This high-cost scenario also assumes that a recession occurs in 2023 and adopts the Fed's most pessimistic forecasts for inflation, interest rates, and long-term economic growth. The result is $7.4 trillion of additional debt by 2032. Chart number 3. Interest spending is set to rise to record levels. In May, the Congressional Budget Office projected that interest costs would reach a record 3.3% of GDP by 2032. This would break the prior record of 3.2% of GDP set in 1991. Updated baseline projections suggest that interest costs will reach 3.4% of GDP by 2032, or as high as 4.4% in the alternate high-cost scenario. This is, of course, problematic because as the debt continues to balloon and as interest rates continue to rise, the cost of servicing the national debt, which we are required to pay by law, will crowd out all other expenditures, including Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. By 2030, the federal government will have no choice but to raise taxes on a broad swath of Americans who have worked hard, saved well, and played by the rules. Chart number 4. Social Security is only 13 years from insolvency. According to the Social Security Trustee Report, the Social Security Trust Fund will exhaust its reserves by 2033. When this rainy day fund is fully depleted, the government will only be able to pay benefits out of incoming tax revenue. Absent any dramatic increase in tax rates between now and then, benefits would have to be immediately reduced by 20 to 23%. Chart number 5. Medicare spending is expected to grow substantially. Medicare faces significant challenges as federal health care costs are expected to increase dramatically relative to the size of the economy over the next 20 to 30 years. In fact, Medicare spending is projected to rise from 4% of GDP in 2021 to about 6% of GDP by 2052. Folks, this is not 6% of the budget, it's 6% of the gross domestic product of the United States, which is a massive, massive number. All this increased spending is largely due to the baby boomers marching out of the workforce and onto the rolls of Medicare. That means 78 million Americans will have stopped putting money into the program and will have begun to take money out. This is further compounded by longer life expectancies and the fact that health care costs are growing faster than the economy. Chart number 6. Inflation is at a 40-year high. The Consumer Price Index, CPI, is up 7.1% from 1 year ago, and the Personal Consumption Expenditures, PCE, Price Index is up 5.5%. These indexes haven't grown at this pace since 1982 and 1983, respectively. Just to give you an idea of how high this is, the Federal Reserve has historically targeted PCE inflation at 2% and CPI at 2.3%. Chart number 7. The Biden administration has approved $4.8 trillion of new borrowing. Since January of 2021, Joe Biden's administration, whether through legislation or executive order, has added a projected $4.8 trillion to budget deficits between 2021 and 2031. According to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, that $4.8 trillion is a result of $4.6 trillion of new spending, $500 billion of tax cuts and tax breaks, and $700 billion of additional interest costs that are partially offset by $400 billion of spending cuts and $600 billion of revenue increases. Okay, folks, so what does all this mean for the future of our country? Well, we're in a bit of a race against the clock. Every year that goes by where the federal government fails to address the underlying fiscal instabilities of our country, the more cataclysmic the day of reckoning on the back end. Not only did the federal government not address these instabilities in 2022, they compounded them. And that means the eventual fix will be all the more austere and all the more draconian. And what kind of fix are we talking about here? We're talking about dramatically higher taxes. So what are you doing to prepare yourself for the tax freight train bearing down on America? Well, if you have the lion's share of your retirement savings in 401ks or IRAs, then now is a time to act. Take advantage of historically low tax rates we'll be experiencing between now and 2030 to get those highly taxable assets repositioned to tax-free accounts. You want to shift that money slowly enough that you don't rise into a tax bracket that gives you heartburn, but quickly enough that you get all the heavy lifting done before taxes go up for good. If you're looking for help to protect your nest egg from the impact of higher taxes, head on over to DaveMcKnight.com and click on the Work with David button. I'm happy to lend a hand. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to drop them into the comment section below. I'll respond to every single one of them personally. And don't forget to click like, subscribe, and the bell so you never miss a video. This is David McKnight. I look forward to seeing you on the next video.